So we're all here today because we see ourselves living in a world in which business and social impact are commingled. And for me, this means living in a world in which 1 billion of our fellow human beings are not living in constant and, I think, avoidable suffering due to extreme poverty. That kind of poverty translates to pretty horrific deprivation for a huge number of our fellow human beings. 300,000 women a year are dying in childbirth, mostly due to avoidable causes linked to poverty. 783 million people live without access to clean water. Over 2 billion lack access to decent toilets and sanitation. And about 1 billion of them, and this is what's most shocking to me, work full-time and still earn less than $2 a day for their efforts. 2 years ago, I met a young man named Ken Kihara, who really makes a lot of these numbers personal for me, who at the time was living in Mathare, which is one of the worst slums I've ever visited in Nairobi in Kenya. And in this area, kids play alongside open sewers. People make a living by scooping up bits of scrap metal and plastic for the recycler. And 10 years ago, Ken was one of those people living in this slum. He had been orphaned when he was about 10 years old. His mother was a victim of multi-drug resistant TB, which also killed 6 of her siblings. And it turns out that living in a slum is a big risk factor for TB. And yet, in spite of all of this, Ken managed to persevere. He got a scholarship to attend one of the best boarding schools in Nairobi, funded by a local church. And there he was almost so poor, he was so poor that he was almost kicked out of school because he couldn't afford things like toothpaste and toilet paper, and he was caught stealing them from his fellow students because he was too embarrassed to ask to borrow this. So this is how poor Ken was. $3, the price of toiletries, was almost enough to cost him his high school diploma. Luckily, the school principal felt very fondly about Ken and managed to let him graduate. And you would think that that would be happily ever after, that this young man who'd managed to persevere, even convincing the principal to let him go after stealing toiletries, would then have a happily ever after story. And yet for so many young people like Ken around the world, graduating, even with a high school diploma, is not enough. That's where the real struggle begins. In Kenya, youth unemployment rates can reach up to 70%. There are simply no jobs for slum kids, even those who speak very good English and finish high school. So Ken had to move back to Mathare after school, and he found a job brewing changa, which is a local kind of moonshine that's often mixed with kerosene and other toxic substances to make it highly addictive. Ken told me that people in the slum drink changa to forget themselves, and that the guys who make it, people just like Ken, earn about $2 a day for brewing this and selling this to other slum residents. Now, this is an awful story, and our typical approach to dealing with it is traditional charity. We see Ken's situation as terrible. We see him as a victim of a great injustice, the injustice of poverty, and of an economic system that doesn't properly value human life. And so we try to deal with his problems outside of that economic system. Now, even though I run a nonprofit to help people just like Ken, a nonprofit that fights the kind of injustice that we just saw through a social business model, it might surprise you that my hope for the world is not to expand our work in the charitable framework. It's not that charity takes over as the predominant model for human progress. In fact, in my vision, charity as we know it is dead. And so is the industry that we call international aid. The entire notion of seeing people as helpless victims is something that I believe we will one day look back on with great discomfort, the same way that we regard colonialism as a paternalistic and reductive view of the rich spectrum of humanity. Let's take a closer look at this model of traditional charity. Mother Teresa might be the poster child for this approach, particularly when it comes to helping the poor. She took a vow of poverty famously, requiring the nuns in her order to possess little more than a set of clothes, a bowl, and a spoon. And she's often heralded as the champion of compassion around the world. She's our poster child for charity and for being an advocate for the poor. And I believe she truly loved the people she helped, and she truly wanted to make a difference. But Mother Teresa never tracked impact metrics for any of the hospice centers that she ran. She believed that doing the work of God was in itself noble, even if that work didn't have a hard-nosed approach to measuring outcomes. And as a result, Some people, very famously Christopher Hitchens, contend that her facilities actually exacerbated conditions of poverty by applying a palliative approach, providing kindness and food, rather than tackling the root causes of that injustice in places like Calcutta. She once, and very famously, said, "I think it's very beautiful for the poor to accept their lot, to share it with the passion of Christ. The world is being much helped by the suffering of poor people." This approach sums up our thinking on traditional charity. So often we perform charitable acts because they make us feel better, rather than demand that we view marginalized people as equals and build our economic and political systems accordingly. This is very personal for me because I come from a family whose history was forged in Calcutta, right around the corner from where Mother Teresa set up her very famous hospice centers. My great-uncle Leila Janah was born into an educated Calcutta family and became one of India's most prominent documentary photographers for the Communist Party. So it's, of course, no surprise that I do social justice work now. This Calcutta is an intellectually rich city that's brimming with artistic marvels and with wry Bengali humor, and to portray it as a filthy slum, to elevate Calcutta's poverty as its defining characteristic, is to miss the point. And that's what we do when we think of people along the single dimension of poverty. We miss the point. We deny their humanity. Mother Teresa is a prominent example of a trend, a wave of charitable activity that has swept the world since the 1950s, and still, despite much evolution in our thinking, dominates the discourse on how to address the problem of poverty for people like Ken. Our current era of international aid started with America's work to rebuild Europe after World War II. The Marshall Plan was intended to be a quick fix to get Europe back on its feet. And in that time, organizations like CARE, a wonderful humanitarian organization I'm on the board of, now a $500 million a year nonprofit, got their start, sending packages of food to hungry families overseas. In fact, this is when the term care package originated with CARE. After the relief efforts subsided, many of these organizations, newly wealthy with allocations of funding from Congress, began expanding to other regions, including post-colonial Africa and Asia. And that's where the multi-billion-dollar aid industry, charity writ large, really got its start. From the beginning, this model had some challenges because something that was meant to be a stopgap, as it was in Europe, ended up becoming a crutch. And in many cases, the wrong incentives conspired to keep it going. In those days, measuring how many people were lifted out of poverty by an aid program was extremely difficult. We lacked the technology tools that we do today. And so instead, we often tracked progress by the number of people we reached, by the number of people we fed. We doled out food aid by the ton, and in the process, we crippled local farmers' ability to supply their countries with low-cost food. American agro-businesses won enormous contracts producing cheap grain for overseas needs, subsidized by us, by the American taxpayer, under the banner of charity. Over the past 60 years, at least $1 trillion of development-related aid has been transferred from rich countries to sub-Saharan Africa, and yet real per capita income today is lower than it was in the 1970s, and over 50% of the African population, over 350 million people, still live on less than $1 a day, a figure that has nearly doubled in 2 decades. So what's wrong with this picture? How did we get here? I think the problem starts at home and in our households, and even in our own minds. And I think it's deeply linked to our identity in America. Most Americans aim to secure ourselves and our families through economic activity, a business of some kind, and many families also take a percentage of their annual income and they put it towards charity. We've been trained to believe that business, traditional business, is what really fuels human progress. And as we all know at BSR, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, the mantra of traditional American business is that we have to focus on maximizing profit to move the world forward and to keep the engine of economic growth churning. Yet at the same time, we seek to balance this hard-driving focus on profit in our business lives with heart and with the effort that we pour into charity, family, and friends. This is the part of our lives where children, aging parents, PTA meetings, and church come in. It's activated when we volunteer at the local animal shelter or when we mentor a neighborhood kid. And this kind of work, we're taught, is motivated more by emotions than by rational thinking. So we deprioritize it. We leave it to nights and weekends. And as a result, we've created a society, a framework in which our head, the business-oriented, profit-maximizing part of our psyche, is fundamentally disconnected from our heart, the socially conscious, compassionate part of our inner world. The future, and what we are all fighting for in this room, is integration. The future is a new definition of profit that properly values social and environmental value creation. Just as we no longer talk about work-life balance in the corporate world, just as that term is kind of passé, because we can only lead one life in which both work and family life are an integral part, we can no longer think of business and social impact as these distinct and bifurcated categories. Each of us has only one lifetime, only one mind, and only one heart. The impact that we seek to make in the social and environmental realm, the vast majority of the improvements we need in health, in education, in the welfare of our fellow human beings to fix some of the problems I talked about earlier, will come from this third sector, this third path of social enterprise. And this path has already emerged between traditional profit-maximizing business, the kind that values shareholders above others, and traditional donation-driven charity, the kind that makes us feel warm and fuzzy. Right? The roots of this movement originated long ago in the efforts around organized labor and efforts to protect workers from blatant exploitation. This later evolved into corporate social responsibility and its cousin, fair trade. The idea that a corporation has a duty to serve humanity is the modern precursor to what I'm calling deeper business. Deeper business is any kind of business that embeds social or environmental justice into its core operating principles. It isn't obviously just about slapping a green or a socially responsible label on a product that's anything but. Clorox famously did that. It was called Greenworks. Some of you might remember that. And during the recession, sales dropped significantly for Greenworks, but not for authentically green brands that adhere to strict environmental and social standards like Method and Seventh Generation. It turns out that consumers care about this stuff, and they're pretty savvy. They can see beyond the hype. The consumers of the next decade, millennials who are growing up and building households of their own, view business very differently from what law dictates in places like Delaware. Just 6% of consumers believe that the singular purpose of business is to make money for shareholders. 80% of young workers want to work for a company that cares about how it impacts and contributes to society. 9 out of 10 consumers are likely to switch brands to one associated with a good cause. So deeper business that challenges the status quo and goes beyond prioritizing profit, is in demand. And we've seen this with a new category of business that emerged in 2008 called benefit corporations. B Corps now account for over $3.5 billion in annual sales and include some of the most celebrated companies of our generation, including Method, Patagonia, Etsy, and Warby Parker. These companies still represent a tiny percentage of the overall market, but they are the vanguard. They are the icons of deeper business. Deeper business also includes a large number of corporations which operate as nonprofits. Our industry is starting to question the model of relying solely on donations to sustain our organizations, and it's also starting to question the traditional way of measuring success by how much money is spent on overhead. For the first time, some donors are requiring the nonprofits they invest in to demonstrate a social return, the same way they demand a financial return for their investment portfolio. This social return is maximized the more a nonprofit can earn its own revenue and stretch the value of those donor dollars further. In fact, I think that the profitable or the break-even nonprofit, what Muhammad Yunus calls the social business, is perhaps one of the best ways to solve social problems, from prison reform to education. This model is another type of deeper business, and should be seen as such, that's free to prioritize social and environmental impact over profit. Many organizations that operate this way are ruthless about tracking impact. One of our nation's favorite examples of this new kind of business model is the Girl Scouts. I was once a member of Brownies, but my feminist mother made me leave because she didn't think the organization prepared women at the time to be successful. Now, the Girl Scouts of Silicon Valley has a robotics program, promotes STEM education and entrepreneurship among girls. And interestingly, the organization also has a very viable earned revenue strategy. Each year, Girl Scouts sells $700 million worth of cookies, which it uses to fund a substantial part of its operation. Goodwill is another cherished American example. In 2011, Goodwill earned more than $4 billion through in-store sales globally and used 82% of that revenue to provide employment to more than 4 million people. Several years ago, I started Sama, a nonprofit that pioneered a new model of employment for poor women and youth in East Africa, South Asia, and Haiti. We call it impact sourcing, and we think it's going to grow to be a bigger and bigger part of this new movement around deeper business. Impact sourcing refers to using your sourcing practices, your company's labor and procurement engine, to proactively create positive social change. Goodwill goes one step further than Girl Scouts in that the social good it creates is through impact sourcing. What if instead of buying cookies and reselling them, Girl Scouts employed marginalized women and unemployed teens to actually make the cookies? That's the premise of impact sourcing. I think it's the best way to fight poverty, to give people opportunity to embrace them in a more progressive view of human capacity than charity. Impact sourcing connects the dots between money that companies spend on producing goods in their supply chains and efforts that traditional charities often take to solve social problems in the same communities. I believe that the untapped brain power at the bottom of the economic pyramid is our most precious global natural resource. The greatest crime today is that this brain power is shackled behind impermeable borders, that capital can move freely across borders, but labor cannot. At SamaSource, we've embraced the digital economy to try to fix this in the short term. And in doing so, we've moved 7,000 workers and their families, close to 30,000 people, from an average income of $2 a day to an average income of $8 a day by training them to do digital work from big companies, including Microsoft, Google, and Walmart. We train them how to do simple tasks like image tagging. This is a really interesting project, but one of our projects is tagging images for Getty Images, the large stock photo archive of celebrities in different contexts. So we have people in these very low-income backgrounds doing this image tagging work and increasing their income fourfold as a result. These simple tasks, which often go unnoticed in our final technology products, are at the base of the new digital supply chains of the future. These are the kind of tasks that are driving the algorithms behind self-driving cars and intelligent chips and devices that surround us today. You all remember Ken, the first person I talked about? Well, since meeting Ken, he got a job initially tagging images for Getty, and now he works as a trainer in the slum that he used to live in Mathare. He started off doing this image tagging and over time developed a passion for training other people, and now has trained dozens of young people in his slum to do similar work. 87% of the workers that go through this Sama program move on to higher education or substantially higher paying work. And this model of impact sourcing, we found, also works here in the US, where we've applied it to what's called the gig or the sharing economy. We have a training program called Sama School that gives low-income people an 8-week boot camp on how to supplement their income through internet-based work by creating profiles and winning work on sites like TaskRabbit, Thumbtack, and Upwork. So far, workers who finish the program are able to increase their income by an average of 27% after this program, and most are starting at the federal poverty line of around $11,000 a year for a single person. So this is what we mean by return on investment. It's not impossible to do in the nonprofit context, it just looks different. Now, I personally believe that Sama needs to be a nonprofit because we don't generate the kind of margin through our programs and activities that can possibly cover the cost of recruiting and training people from extremely low-income backgrounds in non-traditional locations. But I'm not convinced that every impact sourcing business needs to be a nonprofit. A few months ago, we took what we implemented in the digital economy and we applied it to another industry where margins are much larger, namely the luxury goods industry. The luxury market globally is now worth $240 billion, and gross margins in this industry are on average 65%, compared to our industry of basic data services, where they hover somewhere around 20%. Looking at these numbers, I had an idea a few years ago to build an impact sourcing business, just like Sama, in this new category, in luxury goods, that could possibly generate profits that could support our work with Sama. So we started a company called Lakshmi, named after the Hindu goddess of prosperity, which is a luxury skincare company that's impact sourced with raw materials from near where we have Sama source centers in rural northern Uganda. Beauty in action is the brand's mantra, and we believe that beauty should emanate from every aspect of a luxury product. Luxury products shouldn't just make you look and feel good, they should resound with beauty in the way that they're made, from how the people who participated in creating it are treated to how it treats the planet that it came from and will return to. Lakshmi is actually partially owned by our nonprofit as an earned revenue strategy, and I hope over time to show that impact sourcing can work even in retail luxury goods. We're obviously not the first people to talk about this third path, to talk about redefining what we mean by profit. My work is only possible because of a long struggle between advocates for social justice, worker welfare, and the environment, and the traditional forces of capitalism. But I hope that Sama and Lakshmi have taken the struggle one step further towards a deeper idea of integration and a deeper conception of business. These ideas that business can be the primary driver of social good and that charity as we initially conceived it won't solve our problems, these ideas aren't new, but they are still far from mainstream. We in this audience have the power to make these ideas mainstream. We have the power to take us back to the roots of capitalism, which are really the notion that business is the primary driver of social good. We have the power to guide the rest of the world, to show them what's possible when a young man like Ken Kihara breaks free of the shackles of poverty in an urban slum, and to show them how deeper business can make that happen at scale. Work is at the core of human dignity. It's how we define ourselves, and it's how we make our mark in the world. And I believe, through deeper business, that we can reimagine our supply chains and our business practices to include those people like Ken who normally exist outside the parameters of traditional business. This is the only way to end extreme poverty in our lifetimes, and I hope you'll join me in this mission. Thank you so much.